Okay, so hello and welcome to the supporting presentation for the abstract entitled Landscape Response to the Mid-Pleistocene Transition and Higher Frequency Climate Change in the Central Andes. This abstract was submitted to the SSP 2.7 session at EGU this year. My name is Lizzie Orr and I'm currently based at the University of Bristol, and I'm glad that you're here today and interested in this research. Before I begin, I would like to thank my co-authors and funding sources, both from the Strategy Training Group at the University of Potsdam and the GFZ Potsdam, both in Germany. Okay, so in the background of the slide, you can see a Google Earth image of the Upper Toro Basin in northwest Argentina. So we're looking north here. And the range in the background is the Sierra de Pasha. Toro remains a semi-arid intermontane basin. I should say that the climate has varied over time though, but its interior currently receives rainfall of less than about 200 millimeters a year. So moisture is funneled from the Atlantic Ocean and Amazon Basin to the Central Andes via the South American low-level jet. And so the moisture that Toro receives is mainly governed by the South American summer monsoon. So this high altitude dry mountain environment serves as an excellent location to investigate the dynamics of alluvial systems and source distinct sedimentation. And many studies in the basin have tried to tease apart sort of the tectonics, climate, and the earth surface processes responsible for these preserved landscapes. Okay, so the aims of this study were to explore how climate-induced channel responses may or indeed may not move downstream. So whether events within the upper basin can be or have been translated downstream. And secondly, to evaluate whether different climatic forcing frequencies can be observed along the Rio Toro. And so by the end of this presentation, I hope to have convinced you of two things. The first is that the Upper Toro Basin records what we're now referring to as a regional incisional event following the Mid-Pleistocene Transition in the Central Andes, so after about 800,000 years ago. And secondly, that within this basin, there is a disconnect in landscape response to climate between the upper and lower reaches of Toro. Okay. So the rationale behind this project is that there is a relationship between the size or length of a particular catchment and the climatic forcing frequency it can preserve. Okay, so this plot on the left-hand side outlines this theory nicely, where as we increase the river length, we're more likely to see records of the larger, lower frequency climate cycles, okay? So the Google Earth image in the background highlights two things. Firstly, I would like to refer you to the yellow shading, all right? So these are alluvial fans, which are the focus of this study. But before we get onto that, the blue shading shows the fluvial terraces a little bit downstream. And these terraces have been discussed in detail over the last 10 years, a key publication by Steffi, a co-author of this project. So actually, this particular study by Steffi was able to recognize 100,000-year cycles within the terrace record. Okay, so in other words, the authors argued that the cut and fill cycles responsible for their formation follow cycles in eccentricity. And so I've plotted this on this plot here. Okay. So this then raises the question, do the landforms upstream of the terraces record similar climate cycles, or are they different? So because the alluvial fans are positioned upstream, so within the upper sort of 10 to 25 kilometers of the basin, if you did plot them on this graph, there might be a possibility that we would actually be looking at their formation and abandonment following a higher climate cycle frequency, right? A 20,000-year precessional cycle, for example, right? So we're keen to investigate this and see whether our hypothesis is along the right lines. So in other words, we're wondering whether we're going to see these higher frequency climate forcings within our sort of headwaters of these kinds of basins. In order to do this, of course, we need to know the timing of fan formation upstream. Okay. So that's exactly what we did. So if we zoom into the upper sort of the upstream reaches, this is where our fans are, and they're shaded based on their age, which I will sort of talk about in just a moment. But the aim here was basically to determine the timing of fan abandonment and then see how this relates to the terrace record downstream and the records of climate and tectonic activity we have both locally and regionally. And to do this, we use a combination of field-based sedimentology, up here, and geomorphology, and then cosmogenic nuclide geochemistry to get the chronology sort of sorted. So we took boulder samples and a depth profile shown in this map here on the left-hand side to constrain the timing of fan surface activity and abandonment. And then we used remote sensing and topographic analysis to bring all of this together. Now, like most science, things don't always end up turning out how you expected. And the plot under the map shows the different fan surfaces projected against one another. And so the challenge was to understand the fan stratigraphy and our exposure ages that we derived. And so a crucial part of the story is that based on modeled estimates of the paleo surface, which were made by Hilly and Strecker in 2005, we sort of believe that the paleo surface tracked along this grey dash line here about 0.98 million years ago. And so this was a topography of the upper basin, and it looked very different from today. And so we know that then since then, there must have been some extensive incision or sort of major evacuation of sediment. Okay, so perhaps an easier way to digest this is to look at this schematic. And so this will feature quite a lot throughout the presentation. Each surface is shaded differently, and you can see that they all sit at different levels. However, the more earthy browns and reds sit stratigraphically higher than that of the blues, greens, and purples of the lower surfaces. Okay, and of course we have our 0.98 million year surface, our paleotopography on the plot too. Okay, so let's dive into the initial Cosmo data set we've put together. And I should begin by outlining what we assume the exposure ages measure or show us, okay? So these particular ages signify periods of fan surface activity. In other words, the fan surfaces were active during this time. And then the surfaces were then were abandoned shortly after this, okay? So for this particular study, we can identify two primary generations of fan surfaces, which is kind of how I described it in the previous slide. So we have the older surfaces, generation 1 at the top of this slide. And I've got here the PDFs and the initial sort of individual boulder ages too. And they extend from about 900,000 years ago, right the way through to about 300. So it's a long time. The majority of the ages do sit between that sort of 800 to 500K sort of window. And this was completely unexpected, as if you remember, we were predicting that we would find younger alluvial surfaces in the upper reaches of Toro, younger than our terrace record. So as far as we're aware, these are actually some of the oldest fans to be dated using Cosmo. And so it's really exciting. But you'll notice that there's a large spread of ages, and I'm currently looking into the role of inheritance and post-depositional erosion to explain some of this spread. So watch this space. Our second generation of surfaces are indeed much younger and date from about 110,000 years to about 20,000 years ago, so much younger. With them being younger ages and with each surface having a sort of smaller scatter in ages, we ran the Darcy 2019 model for fan surface abandonment. Okay, and this model basically provides an estimate for when the fan surfaces themselves were likely abandoned. And this is shown in the hashed shaded PDFs sort of in the lower plot. So all of our younger surfaces have been abandoned in the last 70,000 years. Okay, so now we know that we have very, very old fan surfaces that sit higher than these younger fan surfaces on our schematic here on the right-hand side. And that all of our surfaces sit well below that sort of original paleo surface that has been modeled. Okay, so let's go into a little bit more detail about the results. The first generation of fan surfaces were largely active, as I said, between that 800 and sort of 500 window, okay? And this has been supported by a really nice depth profile that we resampled for QF1 surface, okay? This profile, again, is one of the oldest and nicest depth profiles we've seen to date, so we're really excited about this, okay? But we do know a little bit now about what's actually going on in the basin during this time. So while generation 1 fan surfaces are active and moving about, we know a few things. So a hydrogen isotope record from Pingel and others captures basically the increased aridity of the basin over the last sort of 800 or so thousand years, following the uplift of the Sierra de Pasha. So these are our source catchment. This is the range that our source catchments are coming from, which basically caused the establishment of an impressive orographic barrier. So after about 800,000 years, we see increased aridity as a result of this barrier. Okay. So there aren't many climate records which extend back this far, so we do refer here to the benthic isotope record. And due to the resolution and range of cosmo ages for each surface, unfortunately, we can't pick out specific climatic conditions which encourage fan development and abandonment, right? However, we can broadly argue that fan surface activity for Upper Toro in this case follows on from the establishment of this orographic barrier and, incidentally, the mid-Pleistocene transition here indicated on the plot. So what we're arguing here is that this generation of fans records an important phase of incision within the basin, which was punctuated by periods of surface stability and aggradation between that 800 and 500,000 year range. So basically, we need to remove a large amount of sediment before the younger fans, generation 2, can sort of start to form. So a net incisional phase around this time is recognized here, but also in other intermontane basins throughout the central Andes. So what might have caused this? Well, at the moment, we think that it might have been triggered by this prolonged and enhanced global glacial cycles following the MPT. So that's really, really exciting. So on to the younger generation of fans, well, these surfaces were active within the last 100,000 years. So on these timescales, there are many more climate records that we can refer to. So we've been able to be a little bit more confident when linking these systems to external forcing. Okay, so we looked into the regional glacial records and that of climate, and we're able to show that fan surface activity largely coincides with enhanced warming, increased aridity, and global interglacials. Okay, so this is fairly consistent with alluvial fan literature, which is available today. Fan surface abandonment, on the other hand, coincides with periods of increased humidity from an intensified monsoon, regional glaciation, and global cooling. So when we look at these phases of abandonment of Toro, which are indicated here in the polygons, the blue polygons, they actually seem to follow a 20,000 year cycle. So in other words, follow a higher frequency, possibly precessional forcing, right? So this is really interesting, as there are fan records both across the central Andes, but also further afield, which share this signal. So have we identified a precessional signal, which is really cool. Okay, so to bring this part of the project together, the main conclusions or highlights are that we can identify a regional incisional event, net incisional event, following the MPT, which we're sort of considering to be the result of sort of these enhanced glacial cycles associated with this time. But we also have higher frequency, possible precessional climate forcing recorded in our younger or generation 2 fans. So I've modified the schematic a little bit to basically better outline this idea, where we have these higher orange generation 1 fans surfaces, and then the green younger fans from generation 2. But of course, this is only part of the story. We now have a better idea of the timing of fan surface activity for Upper Toro, but how does this relate to the rest of the basin and the terraced records? Okay. So let's return to this question again about whether events or climate signals can propagate throughout basins like Toro. So we've looked at this plot before, where a relationship is proposed between river length and then the climate cyclicity, right? And we can plot generation 2, so the younger fans here on the plot, outlined here in the green, okay? This addition supports this idea then that as you move through the basin, the recorded climate cycles are going to change. So we're seeing these perhaps precessional cycles nearer the headwaters, and then eccentricity driven cycles in the terraces further downstream. But where do the older fans sit? Well, to be honest with you, they don't. I mean, our fans are a lot older, far older than the terraces downstream. So perhaps then, are we seeing a disconnect between the Toro Basin? So to recap and address this question, the plot below basically outlines what we know. for the Toro Basin. So the orange and green arrows outline the fan surface activity we've already talked about, okay? So then if we move on within the main basin, so not the upper Toro Basin anymore, just the main basin at large, we have these terraces, right, that date from about 450,000 years. So using this data plus sort of other data within the basin, the panel at the top basically describes what is going on with the basin over the last million years, okay? And so you have a period of basin infilling at the turn of the last million years, and then an evacuation basically event of this sediment. The crucial part here, though, is that while we have these big cut and fill cycles associated with the terraces, we experience a period of relative fan surface stability further upstream. We don't really see anything happening around that mark. And then these regions within the base, this basically suggests then that the regions within the basin are either disconnected or sort of partially decoupled. What we can therefore sort of basically argue then is that whatever is going on in the main basin isn't being translated upstream, and then similarly the other way around too. So where we have this large regional incisional event associated with the MPT that our older fans recognize, that is not recognized sort of further downstream. So then the major question is, what could be the reason for this disconnect? So there are some examples where faults have caused similar disconnect in basin evolution, but for Toro, there's actually no evidence of this. So in the interest of time, I'd like to outline our current sort of conclusion or indeed explanation for this observation. We had a look at the long profile here on the right for the entire basin in more detail, and this is basically what I've done is I've added the terraces onto the long profile and highlighted the 3 tributaries, which are basically home to our alluvial fans. And what we believe here is that we're seeing a nick point, basically characteristically diffuse for this kind of setting here. It's outlined in the red box. Basically, the inset plot shows us in sort of better detail, really. But even if we look at the entire profile itself, I think you can see this nick point where basically you have this step in the profile. And we're really excited about this. And we sort of pinpointed the location of this proposed nick point to the confluence between a tributary, in this case, the name of Choro, and the Rio Toro. So this is where this step up, this nick point, is positioned. And so could therefore the nick point be evidence that perhaps the main basin might march to a different, slightly different drum than the upper reaches, okay? So in addition to the long profile, we wanted to see whether the same kind of thing can be observed in a chi plot, which has been sort of used successfully in the past, and see whether this sort of sheds any further light on the matter. Okay. So chi plots generally are a really nice way to be able to identify significant shifts in channel slope, and for Toro this is actually no different. So the chi plot on the right hand side suggests that we have these specific reaches, which I've labeled across the x-axis, and in other words, basically, you know, the channel slope does actually vary quite a lot throughout the basin. And the sort of main basin plus our tributary catchments that we're interested in are outlined in the bold blue. And so our nick point that we identified in the long profile, but also in the Google Earth image here, can be observed here in our chi plot. So I've outlined this in the red box, okay? And actually this particular, for this chi plot, basically, our nick point is at the boundary between reach 2 and reach 3, okay? So here you can see. Basically, you can also see that at our tributary catchments, where our fans are, there is also a step up in this channel slope. So this could further sort of support the idea that we have a disconnect between these 2 basin areas. Okay, so it's really, really exciting to see that the chi plot supports the long profile and things like that. Okay, so let's think about the nick point a little bit more. So can we actually observe a nick point in the satellite imagery, or is this just something that we can only see in the topographic data? Well, actually, we can see an alluvial fan extending out of the tributary from the tributary into the Rio Toro main channel in this Google Earth image. And in fact, actually, what you can see in this zoomed image here is that you can see that the fan has clearly graded out into the channel, and it's also likely been a bit in size too. and also the main channel above here clearly looks a little bit different to that below, okay, which suggests that it's creating, it's causing some kind of disruption or disturbance, okay. So perhaps this fan, which then is moving material from the Pasha range down into the main basin, is actually responsible for the disconnect that we observe. And so actually you can see on the left-hand side in the Google Earth image that the tributary that sort of the tributary flows through very, very incised topography before it gets to actually to the confluence, and it exposes quite a lot of the geology below these quaternary deposits. So it's really, really cool. Okay, so this is of course not actually the first time that this has been observed, and so a very recent paper by Savi and others last year touches on this idea exactly. The paper itself goes into a lot more detail about how signals propagate throughout landscapes, but I've pulled the relevant bits for this presentation. I definitely recommend this paper for those who are interested. So basically the principle of this idea then is that a nick where we have a nick point is basically recognized because of the interaction between sort of a main channel and a tributary fan, like the one in Toro, and how this interaction changes and creates sort of a shift then, I suppose, in this case, in our long profile. So a typical long profile of this is shown on the left, and it nicely matches that of Toro. So we have this step, right? And the jump in the profile is the fan fed from the tributary as it sort of interacts with the main channel. And so the two scenarios which are suggested by this paper kind of which basically fit our long profile and our kind of setting in Toro. One where basically fan aggradation causes partial coupling between the fan and the main channel. So this is the upper section here. And so basically water and sediment are being moved downstream of the confluence. And the other part of this is that the fan disrupts or decouples the upper reaches of the main channel with that of the lower, right? So these are things that I've mentioned in previous slides as being the case for Toro, right? So the second scenario involves the incision of the fan, where again you have coupling between the fan and the main channel, this time though sort of fairly strong coupling, and then again partial decoupling between the upper and lower main channel, which also sounds about right for Toro. So actually, when we look at the Google Earth image again, we can actually see aggradation. We can see that the fan has come out, it's extended into the main channel, it's likely adjusted channel behavior and flow characteristics. But you can also see that the fan surface itself has been incised, okay? So at present, we'd like to argue that the nick point that we've observed and the disconnect between the upper basin, which of course includes the tributaries, and the main basin, which is the Rio Toro, is the result of a combination of these two scenarios where fan aggradation and incision has introduced sediment from the Pasha range into the main basin, moving material downstream. But that also this landform has caused the disconnect or part of the disconnect between these two regions, right? And so the paper we have referred to here by Savi and others in this slide goes into more detail about the impacts of nick points such as this. But put simply, these fans can actually prevent the translation of sediment signals up and downstream. And we should therefore not be surprised that we're seeing a difference in the landscape response to climate above and below this confluence or nick point, okay? So this demonstrates actually the importance of these single landforms in affecting basin-wide change. So it's pretty impressive. Okay, so to quickly conclude then, this study has been able to recognize a regional incisional event post-MPT following the mid-Pleistocene transition for the Central Andes, and we found that some of the fan surfaces in question also follow higher frequency climate forcing. And then finally, looking at the fans and other records within Toro, we've been able to explore and better understand the reasons behind the disconnect in landscape response to climate within the basin at large. So that's sort of three main points then to come from this study. Okay, and so with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Please feel free to get in touch if you have any questions, and I hope to hear from some of you throughout this week in EGU.